This lecture is going to be on Erasmus, the crown prince of Christian humanists in the 16th century, or in many ways the literary primate of Europe in the 16th century. Often when studying the history of Western intellectual thought or Western political thought, there's often the movement from Aquinas to Machiavelli to Locke to Hobbes, and fast forward into elements of late modern and postmodern thinking. Erasmus tends to get ignored in that fast-moving intellectual political overview of Western intellectual thought, and yet it's Erasmus's thinking that laid the foundations for significant elements of Western education, Western politics, Western peacemaking, attitudes towards Islam, friendship, and many other areas. And so not to be aware of Erasmus's contribution is to then be bereft in terms of making significant decisions in citizenship, what it means to be cultured, what it means to understand a civilization for what it stands for. And so as the crown prince, in many ways, of Christian humanism, he embodies a way of understanding culture, civilization, religion, politics, education in a very organic and integrated manner. And so to ignore him, as I said, is to ignore one of the foundation stones of the house of Western culture and thought. And so what I'd like to do is look at 6 elements of Erasmus's thinking as we leave behind the classical world, the patristic medieval Christian world of which Erasmus drew from, but as we enter the modern world, which was really birthed at the Reformation with the coming to be of various forms of Protestantism. So let me go through these 6 points. I'll linger for a short period of time with them. Needless to say, each of these points, very deep dives could be made of them, but this is just a key in the ignition, a primer in terms of the significance of the ongoing insights of Erasmus that we have. So first, Erasmus on education and memoricide. In the 16th century, when Erasmus was living, there was a division between the Protestant reformers, who argued to renew the church, to renew civilization, one had to return to the Bible. And tradition itself got in the way of this return to the Bible. So people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Anabaptists, the Baptists. There are many others that argued that the Catholic tradition, as they understood it, compromised the white heat fire of biblical thought. So are those who turn specifically to the Bible, and this is what we come to know as the Protestant Reformation. I'll return a little later to the Catholic response to that. But Erasmus was front and center in that movement. He argued very clearly that Jerome's Vulgate and other texts had problems in them, and that for Christians to understand their own heritage, they had to get back to a much more thoughtful understanding of how you interpret the Bible beyond just the literal, grammatical, historical, which Erasmus never negated. In fact, he was probably the most significant biblical exegete from that linguistic tradition in his time, knowing Latin and Greek and Hebrew in a very sophisticated manner. And it was his translation that brought to the fore in the New Testament, significant books of the New Testament, a new version of the New Testament. So that was one wing of the 16th century, a recovery of not only the significance of the Bible, but layered ways of interpreting it rather than a simplistic way of reading the Bible. The other wing of the 16th century was the Renaissance, and so within the Renaissance tradition, there was a turn to the richness and the mother lode of the Greek and Roman heritage in all of its fullness. And sometimes the Renaissance was pitted against the Reformation as if these were two alternate, opposing ways of knowing and being Now Erasmus never in one sense that's just the old replay of the earlier an earlier form of Christianity, is what has the church to do with the academy, Jerusalem to do with Athens. The historic church never went in that direction. It always honored the importance of the academy in the church and the church in the academy, and Jerusalem in Athens and Athens in Jerusalem. And in that sense, Erasmus stands on the shoulders of those who have gone before him, integrating the Renaissance turn to the classical traditions as well as the biblical tradition, and looking at how did these two rich heritages of wisdom, of insight, come together in a meaningful way to inform imagination, to inform the mind, to inform what communities look like and politics looks like in many of these other particular areas. So in Erasmus, where there is beginning to be the shift towards memoricide in Western intellectual thought, in which you either turn to the classics against a biblical Catholic tradition, or to the biblical tradition contra the Roman Catholic and Renaissance tradition, in Erasmus, he wants the full memory of a civilization that stands behind him in terms of what meaningful education is. And it is Erasmus, we talked about a little earlier, paideia as a form of education in wisdom versus technique. In Erasmus's time, and within the Roman tradition, the word they used for technique was humanitas, from which we get the humanities. And it was Erasmus, he made various trips to England as well as on the continent. It was he who in England was asked by John Colet, the Dean of St. Paul's, if he would put together an educational program that would train future generations in the humanities, not people who just had mastered some technique or some skill, but taught them to think in culture and in literature and philosophy and the arts. And it was Erasmus's understanding of education as being grounded in humanities in many ways that has laid the foundation for much of Western approach to what education in principle is meant to be before it has become co-opted as education as a form of technical education. And then the humanities become subordinated, or they're on the margins. But it's the Erasmian tradition of education having the full memory of a civilization which has preceded in all of its best and its worst, its wheat and its tares, its gold and its dross. That is the mark for Erasmus of an educated person. And so with Erasmus you get the continuity of the notion of memory and the wisdom that comes with memory. Now as we have accelerated in the West, we've increasingly lost the significance of the rich view of humanities. Most people today have no background or virtually little background in either the Renaissance tradition of the classics or the biblical tradition itself. And in that sense, we suffer seriously from memoricide, probably the besetting illness of our time, hence the difficulty of making meaningful decisions. Second point, so that's Erasmus on education, and I could expand on that considerably in terms of the classical notion of education as humanities or paideia, and what education today has become, which is just specializing in some narrow little area of a technical skill, or a fragmenting of the disciplines, of which the humanities in that classic sense were about integration of humanities in a meaningful sense. Second, Erasmus in politics. Erasmus was at the center of the major political issues of the time, but as mentioned earlier, he was a humanist, which meant that his understanding of the common good transcended the tribalism of any of the rising nation states at the time. But that didn't mean he became cynical of politics. He was constantly writing letters to princes and to monarchs, challenging them to live up to what their actual vocation and birth meant them to be. Now, interestingly enough, when we think conservatism today within political thought, whether republicanism in the States or, say, conservatism in Canada. We think of a lighter state, lighter taxes, and more power to society. Now, someone like a Thomas More, who was a very dear friend of Erasmus, John Colet, you move through the 16th century up to Richard Hooker. By the end of the 16th century, these were great conservatives of a classical sense. Their view of the state was something, one, that you don't become cynical of it or retreat from it into society and pit society against the state, just as in education you pit the Bible against the classical tradition. But again, it's an integrated vision of state and society working together for the common good, in this case either of England or Europe or other parts of the world. And so in Erasmus's understanding of politics as a humanist, he never capitulated. In this sense, he's often been called a wild bird. He could not be caged easily by any political ideology because he believed there were ideals higher than political tribalism of whatever nation state was emerging at the time. And so his humanism informed his political thinking, which didn't mean he retreated in cynicism from the state because of its contradictions, its hypocrisy, the wars which were emerging at the time in the 16th century, but he constantly was engaged in challenging heads of state and those who served those heads of state to live up to the ideals of what a state is meant to be. And so it's a humanism, it's a political humanism, which doesn't slip into the one hand cynicism, skepticism, in which a person becomes impotent and all they do is protest, nor on the other hand a genuflecting to the state in what's called the Constantinian approach, or Caesaropapism in the Eastern Oriental tradition. This was a prophetic tradition of the true humanism in which the state and society is honored. Both can distort what they're meant to be, but both have ideals, if brought together meaningfully, that bring together a just and peaceful and ecologically responsible way of understanding the common good. This then leads me to my next point, Erasmus as the leading dove of the 16th century. Many was the clash that was emerging politically, religiously in the 16th century, in which denominations were forming. I mentioned early Lutheranism. Just after Erasmus died, the emergence increasingly of the Reformed tradition under Calvin, the Anabaptists in the 16th century, which have become the Mennonites as we know them today. Baptists are emerging. For Erasmus, a lot of this came out of each person thinking their particular interpretation of a text or the political common good was just and it was right and it was true. But Erasmus argued we are all finite and fallible. We all need one another because each brings to interpretations of the past, of the text, of political ideology, their own finite, limited perspective. Hence the need of people from various and conflicting positions to hear and heed one another for the greater good. And his building bridges approaches, and he was the preeminent peacemaker of 16th century Europe. Significant elements of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition drew deeply from the Erasmian perspective, in particular his reading of the Beatitudes, the notion of Christ as the King of Peace. His whole philosophy Christi in Erasmus was very much about internalizing the theology, the past, the texts, for peacemaking in his time in an age of conflict and fragmentation. And so Erasmus, at a political and religious level, very much was on the forefront of building bridges between different political perspectives that were moving to the right or to the left, nation states which were emerging, religious denominations which were fragmenting. And it was his understanding of the best of the Renaissance, the best of the biblical, the best of the Catholic tradition, when properly internalized, that embodied a way in thought, word, and deed of healing the increasingly breach which was emerging, and how people were turning on one another viciously and violently, either verbally or eventually which was going to lead to war. that began the division of Europe into nation states politically and then denominations religiously. Erasmus saw all this, and he saw where it was going, where people were not listening to one another, they were not hearing one another, they were not heeding one another, they were not willing to recognize that their own perspective was limited and needed the insights, more importantly often than those they disagreed with the most. In that sense, the divisions politically, all in the name of justice, or renewing the church, or forming a better nation state, and the consequences of that in terms of war. You secularize that today, you're into the culture wars and cancel culture and people polarizing. In that sense, what we're facing today is absolutely no different than what was happening in the 16th century. Somewhat more benign in the way it's happening today. We don't go around executing people if we differ with one another, but we do that verbally, we do that rhetorically, we do that, as I mentioned, through dismissing a platform they're on. I mean, this is really just 16th century ways of interpreting differences that then lead to the executing, the dismissing, the canceling people who we disagree with. Erasmus, as the bridge builder, would have, in his time, stood up in many ways like a King Canute, trying to resist the intense tidal waters of political ideologies that polarized, and arguing that this way of thinking just leads to further polarization and division. One only has to look at the 16th century to see how that way of thinking led and the consequences of it to understand how that way of thinking plays itself out today. And this is why history is very important. You just look at certain epistemological ways of knowing where they lead, and then ask, is this where we want to go in terms of people shrinking into little tribes, ideological clans, and the greater good disappears for the sake of each person's understanding of justice or ecological concerns or peacemaking. Erasmus had the big picture of what it meant to overcome smallness, to overcome reactionary temperaments for the greater good, and if that did not occur, what was likely to be the consequence of which he saw and of which we see only so clearly today. The other great threat to Western civilization in the 16th century, there was the internal threat, obviously the clash within the Roman Catholic tradition and between Roman Catholics and emerging Protestantism and the consequences of that. The other threat to the West was emerging and growing Islam, or what was seen as the Muslim threat. Middle of the 15th century, Constantinople had been taken over by the Muslims. Islam was coming into Europe through Eastern Europe. Vienna looked like it was going to go down. Italy was looked like it was going to be a means of the vanguard of Islam. Previously, the Andalusian situation in Spain, Muslims had dominated there. And so this is another issue we face today, in that sense no different than what Erasmus faced in the 16th century, the threat of Islam. And there were a variety of ways of interpreting that in the 16th century. Just as there was in terms of the Crusades earlier. Muslims had taken over Jerusalem, the Holy City, and come the Crusades, and of course the clash inevitably between Christians and Muslims. So the story went ever on, only the drama was now being played out, increasingly so in 16th century Europe. Erasmus's view, once again, his argument was that, first of all, be wary of slipping into the hawkish position. Crusades were just centuries before them. Where does that hawkish polarization, so just as Protestants were hawkishly fragmenting with Roman Catholics, Catholics were fragmenting within their own tradition. Now you had Christian hawks, whether Catholics or Protestants, their attitude towards Islam. So what was the role then of a Christian peacemaker, not only in relationship to increasingly divided Christendom, but also in relationship to Islam itself? The other extreme, of course, is the one argument from an element of the left at that time is that the emergence of Islam coming into Europe was a punishment from God for their own divisiveness, their own lack of justice, their own lack of integrity. Now, Erasmus was never an absolute pacifist or a dove in that sense. He was an owl, and he was always opposing, on the one hand, the aggressive hawks, either within his own heritage or within Islam itself. And so as an owl, he's constantly in the midst of discerning what does it mean to be a peacemaker, and who are the Muslims you can be peacemakers with versus those you can't, just as with Christians you can't. And so where are the peacemakers within both these traditions, and what does it mean to work with them? And so just as today, where you get right-wing people who argue that Islam is only violent, and you have leftists who will argue that it's only a good, the great civilizations and the mosques and the mathematics and medicine. And so in between there, Islam, just like Christianity, has both elements in it. And a peacemaker is willing neither to demonize on the one hand, nor to idealize or romanticize a tradition on the other hand. And so Erasmus' engagement with Islam was once again part of a peacemaking way of trying to find the way forward, which neither demonized nor idealized. This is the work of the owl. The next point then is point 5, in which Erasmus engages Luther in the Reformation, because there was no doubt in the 16th century the Catholic tradition was divided internally. There were people defending elements of Christianity and Christendom that should not have been defended. And Erasmus, like More and John Colet before him, called the Oxford Reformers, these were some of the leading people long before Luther came along, who were vigorously and in an animated way critiquing the Roman Catholic Church at the level of thought, word, and deed. But they were loyal but critical but loyal. They believed the church could be reformed. In our age, we tend to have a lot of people who are critical, deconstruct, but loyal to nothing other than criticism itself. Now, the humanist tradition, the irenical humanist tradition, knew how to live in a difficult tension of loyalty and criticism. Criticism and loyalty. Lesser people either are loyal but they don't criticize, or they're critical but not loyal. And as I mentioned, then criticism becomes its own loyalty. They're just loyalty to deconstruction. Someone like a More or an Erasmus or John Colet constantly lived in this tension, believing that if you fragment those things, the critical type will just fragment, as we see today, and which was already occurring in the 16th century. The loyalty type just perpetuate injustice and a way of thinking that reinforces the status quo, that really in the long run undermines what a tradition is meant to stand for. And so in someone like Erasmus in the Reformation, his initial, and probably one of his most animated opponents, who was initially, they were on the same page in critiquing the Catholic Church, Martin Luther. Luther, after going through a series of thinkings exegetically, biblically, thought he could renew the Catholic Church. He took the position, finally he couldn't. And so in Luther you get a prototype, again, of the modern critic who only knows how to criticize, and then splits off. There's no loyalty to the richness of a tradition in all of its good, bad, and ugly elements, but drawing the best of the good to reform it. And so in Luther, you get the prototype, as I mentioned today, of those who critique. They break off and start their own groups. Those groups usually critique and break off further. So you get this increasing fragmentation, anarchism that we see with us today. But so Luther is really a key figure. So Erasmus had to deal, on the one hand, the Luther type that criticizes and fragments, but is loyal to nothing than criticizing or fragmenting. And of course, the Reformed tradition will break from the Luther, and the Anabaptists from the Lutheran, whatever. The conservative element in the Roman Catholic Church formed the Council of Trent, in which they then put Erasmus on the index. So these are the loyalists who did not want to substantively critique, or their understanding of reforming the church was very limited. And so Protestantism became the enemy for the Tridentine form of Catholicism, which lasted up to Vatican II in the 1960s, in which some of the most courageous thinkers like Erasmus were put on the index and was viewed as someone who was to be seen as suspicious. Interesting enough, Erasmus's dearest friend was Thomas More. Thomas More is viewed as a saint in the Catholic tradition. Erasmus isn't. And you get these interesting contradictions between someone who was held high, like More, who was a martyr under Henry VIII, and Erasmus, close friend, who was put on the index. The sixth point, which I will conclude with, is Erasmus held high as philosophy is meant to be, above all the importance of friendship, philia, Greek word for friendship, and sophia, wisdom. For Erasmus, friendship always transcended, as a great humanist, the ideologies of the left, the center, and the right. And Erasmus was known for his friendships. And many were the people across England and Europe who Erasmus befriended, who stood in different political and ideological positions in that way. And so philosophy is not, in that classical sense, that humanist sense that you get in the biblical, that you get in the best of the Catholic and the Renaissance tradition, about dissecting ideas. And I might note that one of Erasmus's major criticisms of late medieval education, or scholasticism, was that philosophy was reduced to dissecting ideas and following arguments in a logical way. In many ways, even the dimming and demeaning of what Aquinas was after. It was about friendships growing and supporting one another as they listened to Lady Sophia, or wisdom itself. And so for Erasmus, philosophy, and you get this in Aristotle's book 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Plato's Lysias, of course you get it in Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, many of these great thinkers. Friendship was foundational. And so this final point in terms of friendship for Erasmus was foundational to so much that he did. Might also just add that the lecture I did on mythos and logos, Erasmus did over one of his book, Adages, he had over 4,000 little proverbs or wisdom sayings which he drew from a variety of cultures and civilizations. In those over 4,000 adages or proverbs, again, wisdom is very important. Practical wisdom in terms of how we live, how we make decisions, how we treat other people, how we engage politics, what's the nature of war, what's the nature of peace. And so these 4,000, more than 4,000 actually, aphorisms that you get in the adages, Erasmus's adages, they come together very nicely to articulate and embody what it means to be concerned with friendship, to be concerned with wisdom, and how that can be embodied and incarnated through the best understanding of the classical civilization, the biblical tradition, in an integrated visionary whole. And of course, Erasmus's vision increasingly came under attack by on the one hand, the Roman Catholic tradition, as I mentioned, at Trent, and then the fragmentary Protestant tradition. But it's the Erasminian tradition that then paved the way for another Dutchman. Erasmus was born in Holland, Hugo Grotius, and his great work on international law, natural rights, natural laws. They're embodied in international standards, which then point forward to, by the 20th century, we're getting League of Nations or United Nations, international law, standards of international human rights. These are all traditions, really, that go back to Erasmus and his cosmopolitan humanism that transcended the tribalism of any political, religious, background. And so in sum, the 6 points in terms of Erasmus: his understanding of education and humanities, a corrective to emerging memoricide, his humanism in politics, transcending the tribalism of any tradition and yet very committed to the role of the state and society for the common good, his politics of peace as the great dove of the 16th century, his interaction with emerging Islam, avoiding again the extremes of right and left, his engaging with Luther and then the Roman Catholic tradition. So just as politics was fragmenting, so was religion. And then finally his understanding of philosophy, or philosophia, as a journey of friendship into wisdom itself, as the great humanist ideal. And higher than that was love, and so the relationship between knowledge, wisdom, and the very apex of that hierarchy is the unity of which love is about. And for Erasmus's political vision, unity is foundational, not unity in a silly sense in which difficulties and conflicts are ignored, but unity which brings together the best of justice and peace in people, thinking out of their own small little egos, their own little sort of soul houses they live in, for the greater mansion of what it means to be fully human and fully alive.